When Mark Wahlberg walked into the Jimmy Kimmel live studio, he wasn't there to pick a fight. He was there to promote his new film, shake a few hands, and maybe share a couple of funny stories. But the thing about live television is you can't predict the moment when banter turns into battle. And tonight, under the glare of the studio lights, a simple joke was about to ignite something no one in the audience would forget. The Los Angeles night outside was still buzzing when the audience began filing into the Jimmy Kimmel live studio. Laughter echoed off the walls as people found their seats, clutching paper cups of coffee and the glossy souvenir cards that read applause in big block letters. Overhead, stage lights hung like a fleet of miniature suns, bathing the set in a warm glow. The desk was polished to a perfect shine, and behind it, Jimmy Kimmel was in his element, cracking a few off-the-cuff jokes for the warm-up crowd, his signature smirk firmly in place. Backstage, Mark Wahlberg rolled his shoulders as he stood in front of the mirror. His stylist made a final adjustment to his gray suit jacket, the crisp white shirt underneath hinting at his non-uncensored style. Mark had been through countless interviews, but Jimmy had a reputation. The man was sharp, unpredictable, and not above stirring the pot if it meant a few extra laughs. 2 minutes, Mark, a stagehand, called out. Mark nodded, offering a small smile. His publicist leaned in, whispering, "Remember, keep it light. Talk about the movie, the family. They love that." He didn't need reminding. Mark knew how to play the game. But what neither he nor his team could have known was that Jimmy had decided to open with a topic that wasn't on the agreed list, one that poked at a nerve Mark rarely exposed. The applause sign lit up as the show returned from commercial break. Jimmy, sitting behind his desk with an almost mischievous twinkle in his eye, leaned toward the camera. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mark Wahlberg." The crowd erupted. Cheers filled the studio as Mark strode out from the wings, giving a quick wave before shaking Jimmy's hand. They exchanged pleasantries and Mark took his seat in the plush guest chair. Jimmy started light. "Mark, you're looking good, man. Is this movie star good, or I'm still trying to prove I can beat up anyone in this room?" "Good." Mark chuckled, leaning back. "Bit of both." Jimmy got to keep people guessing. The audience laughed. On the surface, everything seemed normal. Two pros exchanging quick banter, but then Jimmy's grin widened just a little too much. "So, I've been reading about your new movie," Jimmy began. "But before we get into that, I just have to ask, what's harder, acting in an intense action scene or explaining that Boston accent to people who think you're just doing a bad British impression?" The crowd roared. Mark smiled politely, but his eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "Well, Jimmy, I'd say explaining it too, you might be the hardest job I've had." Laughter again, but this time it carried an edge. Jimmy leaned forward. "Come on, man, you know I love you. But hey, speaking of tough jobs, I read somewhere you almost became a priest. That's quite the career swerve. How do you go from holy water to Hollywood?" The audience giggled, sensing the ribbing. Mark gave a measured laugh. "I think we both know the entertainment industry could use a little divine intervention." A beat passed. Jimmy raised an eyebrow. The audience was hanging on every word now. Something in the air had shifted subtly but unmistakably. And that was just the first 5 minutes. It started as a slow burn. The kind of back and forth you'd expect between two men who have made careers out of being quick on their feet. But somewhere, between the laughs and the jabs, Jimmy stopped playing for chuckles and started playing for the clip that would go viral. The first commercial break had just ended. The applause faded as cameras rolled again, capturing Jimmy leaning casually on his desk, a mischievous spark in his eye. Mark sat opposite him, relaxed in posture, but with a subtle stiffness of someone waiting for the other shoe to drop. So Jimmy began flipping through his cards like a man pretending to be unprepared. "This new movie of yours, Steel Horizon, right? Lots of explosions, car chases, the usual Wahlberg package, but tell me this, do you ever look at the script and think, wow, I've basically been playing the same guy for 20 years? The crowd chuckled. Mark's jaw tightened ever so slightly. "I like to think I bring something new to every role," he replied, too evenly. "Different layers, different energy. But hey, I know you've been making the same desk jokes for 20 years. Too, Jimmy." The audience gasped, then erupted in laughter. Jimmy smirked, clearly enjoying the pushback. "Touché, but at least my jokes don't blow up half a city block." "Yet," Mark shot back, deadpan. They laughed again, but Jimmy wasn't done. He leaned forward, elbows on the desk, voice dipping into that faux-friendly tone late-night hosts use right before they twist the knife. "Speaking of your layers, Mark, you've had an interesting career arc. Rapper, underwear model, action star, almost priest. Oh, and there's that little thing about your colorful past. You ever think about how crazy it is that Hollywood embraced you?" The air in the studio shifted. The crowd's laughter softened into a murmur. Mark didn't flinch, but his gaze locked on Jimmy like he'd just been called into the ring. "You mean, do I think about how much work I've put in to change my life? Every day," Mark said slowly, his voice dropping a register. "And maybe you think it's a joke, but I take it pretty seriously. Jimmy raised his eyebrows, pretending innocence. Hey, I'm just saying, it's a redemption story. People love that. Mark's smile was tight. Yeah, but usually they tell it without trying to make you the punchline. The audience went quiet. This wasn't the snappy, friendly banter they had come for. This was a step-downs. The stage lights felt hotter, the hum of the cameras louder. For a moment, neither man moved. Then Jimmy shifted tactics. All right, he said with mock surrender, flipping to another card. Let's talk family. You've got 4 kids, right? How do they feel about dad running around on screen, punching bad guys and blowing stuff up? Mark's face softened. They roll their eyes mostly. To them, I'm just dad, not some action hero. My daughter still beats me at mini-golf and doesn't let me forget it. The audience laughed, the tension easing. Jimmy smiled, but his eyes still carried that glint of unfinished business. So, they don't think you're cool at all? Jimmy asked. Nope, Mark said. Not even close. Well, Jimmy replied with a grin. At least you've got the Boston accent to fall back on. Mark tilted his head. Here we go again. The crowd chuckled. Jimmy was back on his favorite running gag, but this time he went further. I mean, seriously, you could be giving the Gettysburg Address and half the country would think you're ordering a meatball sub. The laugh was big, too big. Mark's smirk didn't reach his eyes. You know, Jimmy, Mark said slowly, I've worked with a lot of comedians. The good ones know when to stop. It was subtle, but the audience picked up on it. This wasn't scripted anymore. The rhythm was off. Jimmy sat back in his chair, crossing his arms. You telling me to stop, Mark? He asked, smiling, but not really smiling. I'm telling you, I'm here to talk about my work, Mark replied, not give you ammo for your next stand-up routine. For a second, Jimmy seemed ready to change the subject, but then he leaned in again, breaking one of the oldest rules in show business. Don't poke the guest when they've already bristled. So, speaking of your work, Jimmy said slowly, I read you turned down a certain superhero role. Big paycheck, big franchise, the works. You ever regret that, or was it one of those too much work, not enough abs situations? The crowd oohed. Mark gave a short laugh, but it was hollow. No regrets, he said. I don't take roles I can't commit to. Pretty simple. Jimmy grinned. I hear you. I mean, I've turned down plenty of jobs like I could have hosted The Tonight Show, but then I remembered I like having my own show. Mark looked at him for a long moment. Yeah, and I like not needing to make a living off taking shots at people sitting right in front of me. The laughter, this time, was smaller, edgier. The audience sensed they were no longer watching 2 men having fun. They were watching 2 men circling each other. By the time they cut to the next commercial, the tension was thick enough to slice. Mark leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. Jimmy shuffled his cards, glancing toward his producer with a half smile that said, this is getting good. The studio audience whispered among themselves. They didn't know it yet, but they were halfway to witnessing one of the most uncomfortable and unforgettable interviews of Jimmy Kimmel's career. The jokes had stopped landing, the smiles had stopped being real, and somewhere between Jimmy's smirk and Mark's unblinking stare, the studio realized this wasn't just an awkward moment. It was the start of a full-on clash. The second segment, after the break, started like any other. Upbeat music, Jimmy's trademark wave to the camera. But the tension from the earlier exchange hadn't dissipated. If anything, it had thickened, hanging in the air like humidity before a storm. Jimmy leaned in with that playful grin again. So, Mark, I heard you've been spending a lot of time back in Boston lately. Family? Old friends? Avoiding Los Angeles? Or are you just hiding from your last box office flop? The crowd gasped audibly this time. It wasn't a gentle jab, it was a hard right hook. Mark chuckled low, deliberate. You know, Jim, the thing about Boston is people there tell you to your face when they don't like you. Not with a smile in a studio audience. Laughter rippled awkwardly across the crowd, but it was nervous laughter. The kind that came with glances toward the stage, wondering if they were watching the moment everything fell apart. Jimmy shrugged theatrically. I'm just asking the questions. People want to know. Mark's eyes narrowed. No, you're asking the questions you think will get you a trending clip. That landed. Jimmy's smirk faltered for half a beat before returning. Well, you're welcome for the free publicity. Publicity is only good if you're not making yourself look like a clown in the process. Mark shot back. The audience oohed. The cameraman instinctively pushed in for a tighter shot. Somewhere off to the side, a producer's hand hovered over the signal to cut to commercial, but Jimmy wasn't about to back down. He leaned forward on his desk, speaking in a tone that was half mocking, half provocative. You know, Mark, you've always had this tough guy thing going on. But it's funny, you're sitting here getting prickly over a few jokes. Makes me wonder if the tough guy is just for the camera. Mark didn't blink. You can wonder all you want, but there's a reason I don't need cue cards to say what I think. The jab about cards hit home. The audience erupted into scattered applause, and Jimmy's expression tightened just slightly, that flash of irritation slipping through before he masked it again. Hey, Jimmy said, holding up his hands. "I'm just doing my job." "And I'm just doing mine," Mark said. "Which, by the way, is not sitting here so you can run through your little list of recycled insults." The room's temperature seemed to rise. Jimmy shifted in his chair, deciding whether to push or pivot. He pushed. "All right, then," Jimmy said, smiling. "Too wide. Tell me about this workout routine you have been posting on Instagram. The 4 a.m. wake-ups, the protein shakes, the punching bag. Is that discipline, or are you just desperate to prove you've still got it?" Mark leaned forward now, elbows on his knees, closing the gap between them. "Jimmy, I've been getting up early and putting in the work since before you had this desk, and I'll still be doing it when someone else is sitting there." The crowd gasped again. Jimmy's eyes flicked sideways toward his crew. The moment wasn't lost on him. By now, the banter had crossed the point of no return. Every laugh from the audience was strained. Every beat of silence was heavier than the last, but Jimmy, sensing the viral potential, pressed on. "So if you're so committed to the work," Jimmy said, "why do people say you just play the same guy in every movie?" Mark smiled faintly, not the warm smile of a man taking it in stride, but the tight-lipped one of a man sharpening a response. "People say a lot of things. Some say late-night hosts have been doing the same monologue for 15 years. Doesn't make it true." That one drew gasps, laughs, and even a few cheers. Jimmy's smile was still there, but his posture had stiffened. "I see," Jimmy said, tapping his cards on the desk. "So now you're the comedian." "No," Mark replied, his voice calm, but cutting. "I'm just not afraid to call it like I see it." The pause afterward was long enough to make even the seasoned camera operators shift in their seats. This wasn't banter anymore. This was personal. The producers knew they had a problem. They also knew they had television gold. As the segment dragged toward the next break, Jimmy forced a laugh, changing the subject to the movie again, but the tension lingered. Mark answered curtly, professionally, but the warmth was gone. When the cameras cut, Jimmy leaned back in his chair and muttered something under his breath. Mark's head tilted, eyes narrowing. He didn't respond. Damn, not yet. The final segment was coming and both men seemed to know it. That's where the explosion would happen. For 40 minutes, the tension had been simmering just beneath the surface. Now it was about to boil over. And when it did, the audience, the crew, and Jimmy Kimmel himself would be left stunned, watching one of the most uncomfortable live exits in late-night history. The final segment began with a forced smile from Jimmy, the kind you put on when you're determined to finish a dinner you wish you'd left an hour ago. "Well," he said, tapping his cards, "before we wrap up, let's talk about your new movie. I mean, it's not like you came here to just insult your host." Laughter, nervous, uneven, came from the audience. Mark sat still, leaning slightly forward, hands clasped loosely in front of him. "I came here," he said, "to talk about the work. But it's hard to do that when you keep steering it toward your comedy roast." Jimmy tilted his head, finding innocence. "Hey, my job's to keep things interesting." Mark's brow furrowed, his voice staying calm, but growing heavier. "There's interesting, and then there's disrespectful. You've been walking that line all night, and you know it." The audience's murmurs swelled. They could feel it. This wasn't playful anymore. It was confrontation in its purest form. Jimmy's eyes darted to the cameras, then back to Mark. "Oh, come on. You're a tough guy, right? You can take a few shots." Mark leaned back in his chair, then forward again, planting both elbows on the desk between them. "I can take a lot, Jimmy. I've taken worse from people who actually mattered in my life. But I don't confuse taking shots with letting someone waste my time." Gasps rippled across the studio. Jimmy's jaw tightened. The banter had turned into a standoff. No escape without someone backing down. "All right," Jimmy said, flipping through his cards. "Since we're so pressed for time, I'll make this quick. A lot of people think you're too serious. You ever wonder if maybe that's why people enjoy ribbing you because you can't laugh at yourself?" Mark didn't even blink. "I laugh plenty, just not at cheap shots disguised as jokes." Jimmy exhaled sharply, leaning back. "Maybe you should stick to punching people in movies. You seem better at that." Mark smiled faintly, and that smile was somehow more intimidating than anger. "Maybe you should stick to interviewing people you can talk over." The crowd erupted, half in shock, half in applause. Jimmy's smile vanished entirely now. He set his cards down, clasped his hands, and said, "You know what? If you're that unhappy being here." Mark stood. "I am." The studio froze. Camera operator scrambled to follow him as he rose from his chair, smoothing his jacket, and gave one last glance toward the audience. "Thank you for coming out tonight, folks. Sorry you didn't get the show you expected." The audience roared, some cheering, some booing, all on their feet. Jimmy stayed seated, his eyes fixed on Mark, jaw clenched so tight the muscles in his face twitched as Mark walked off stage. A couple of audience members reached out for high fives. He obliged without breaking stride, heading straight for the backstage curtain. Jimmy turned back to the camera, forcing a smirk. "Well, Mark Wahlberg." Everybody, the applause was half. Even the band's exit riff felt awkward. cutting off after a few seconds. The moment wasn't just television. It was history in the making. In the control room, producers were already buzzing, knowing they'd have to do damage control with Mark's team. But another voice cut through the case. "Do not cut that. That's going viral." And they were right. By morning, the clip would be everywhere. Headlines, talk radio, trending, Mark Wahlberg walks out on Jimmy Kimmel would dominate feeds, and everyone would have an opinion on who crossed the line. For those who had been in the studio that night, one thing was certain. You could feel the shift in the room. The laughter had stopped being fun long before the exit. And when it ended with the kind of finality that left no room for second chances. If you were watching this live, you already know this wasn't just a celebrity spat. It was a collision between two personalities who weren't going to give an inch. But here's the real question. Who was in the right? Was Mark justified in walking out, or should he have stayed and finished the interview? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this one's going to divide people. And if you enjoy behind-scenes breakdowns of the most explosive talk show moments, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss what we've got coming next, because if you think this was tens, you haven't seen what we're covering next.